Hi everyone, my name is Leah Davis Witherow and I'm the Curator of History for the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. Thank you for joining me today for a Lunch and Learn lecture on Colorado Women Led the Way, the Battle for Women's Suffrage, to talk about the 5-decade struggle of women in Colorado to gain the right to vote for themselves, first in 1893, but also their continued work on behalf of their sisters, mothers, friends, cousins, grandmothers across the country, leading up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So thanks for joining me, and let's get started. First of all, this is a momentous year in national history and in Colorado history, as it is the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and our state is doing a lot to celebrate this important occasion. So if you go to historycolorado.org, 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Colorado, you'll get lots of information about activities, tours, programs happening all across the state. History Colorado is really the clearinghouse for all the information. They have a master calendar. My thanks to my colleagues up there for doing such a great job organizing activities and helping spread the word about activities throughout the state. So to get started, what does suffrage mean? It's kind of a confusing word to some folks. It's literally and essentially the right to vote in political elections. It has some archaic definitions related to prayers or petitions, but one thing I want to talk about right off the bat is that I'm going to use the term suffrage versus suffragette. Suffragette was a term coined by a British journalist to demean or diminish the work of suffragists in Great Britain, and the E-T-T-E on the end of the word suffrage minimizes, it's small, it diminishes, it's like luncheonette, small suffragist. And suffragists might have called themselves, they might have moved in between those two words, they might not have, but suffragette started out as a derogatory term. So we're not going to use it today. We're going to use the term activist or suffragist or proponent. So I don't know about you, but when I was back probably in middle school or high school, and we talked about women's rights, the conversation literally began and seemed to end in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, which we have a list of famous attendees on the screen so that you can see, none other than Lucretia Mott, Frederick Douglass, folks that were both abolitionists and suffragists attended this important convention. They were signatories to the Declaration of Sentiments. But in truth, American women had voted prior to 1848. They voted in the colonial era in America, and we know that they voted in the early republic. Recent research done by our colleagues at the Museum of the American Revolution actually document poll sheets from the 18 teens in New Jersey that show women voting. It's a larger question about if they had the right to vote, why did they have it taken away? It's part of that tumultuous time known as the Market Revolution, when dramatic economic, political, and social shifts were taking place in our country. The story we often like to share is that democracy was slowly expanded over the course of the 19th century. And in fact, that doesn't necessarily turn out to be true. So some women, depending on the state, had voting rights and then actually had them taken away. So in 1848, the folks that were present, some of them had memories of them voting or their grandmothers voting, etc. So the story doesn't begin in 1848, and it definitely doesn't end there. So I love to use illustrations when telling the story of suffrage. By the way, I have my 19th Amendment coffee mug right here. This is called The Awakening, and it was created in 1915. Something interesting to note that by 1915, 4 million women in the West were already voting. They're voting in local elections, state elections, and in national elections. Because as it turns out, the story of women's suffrage in America is a story that is really about the West. And so this illustration perfectly symbolizes the fact that this movement, this intellectual movement, expansion of rights, actually moves from the West to the East. So on our left, we see Lady Columbia, and she is wearing a beautiful golden Greek gown as a nod to Grecian democracy. She is carrying a lighted torch of knowledge in her hand as she's pointing to the east, and she's marching across the western states. She's bringing knowledge, she's bringing democracy with her from the west to the east. And on the right side of the image, you see her sisters, mothers, cousins, all the other women reaching out for those rights, reaching out for that knowledge. And this is a story that is unlike what we have often been told, that all the great intellectual or reform movements in American history came to us from those on the Atlantic seaboard and spread from east to west, when in fact, the story is actually about ideas germinating, taking hold in the west, and moving to the east. So when I said it was a Western story, we can see here in this sort of roll call of states that Western states truly led the way. Wyoming was the first territory to give women the right to vote. You might often hear Wyoming was the first state to grant women suffrage. It's not quite true. There's a technicality that I'd like to point out. Wyoming was a territory when it granted women the right to vote, meaning a few dozen men in the Wyoming territorial legislature got together and they extended suffrage to women. Whereas in Colorado, I've bolded it, it's a little further down the list. In Colorado in 1893, we are the first state to grant women's suffrage by popular referendum, meaning the majority of voters, all male, went to the polls in 1893 and extended the right to vote to women in Colorado. And so that's an important difference and something in Colorado that we should be really proud of. So looking at some of the other territories and states, we see Utah Territory. They had it actually removed in 1887. They had to wait until statehood to get it back. Washington Territory, women could vote briefly for about 6 years, lots of lawsuits involved, and then women had it taken away once Washington became a state. As we go down along the lines, Idaho, California, Oregon, and Kansas. And on the right, we see this awesome graphic of the United Equal Suffrage Association of America, and it has four stars on the blue background, because as they're stating in this graphic, only 4 states are truly American. Only 4 states truly represent the promise of democracy as granted to us in the Constitution. So it's important to talk about the ideas regarding suffrage, and the conversation about suffrage did not arise in 1893, even though that's when women gained the right to vote in Colorado. It actually begins much earlier, during our territorial period. January 3rd, 1870, our territorial Republican Governor General Edward McCook, someone who'd served in the Civil War, so he's a unionist, he's anti-slavery, he comes out, he's appointed territorial governor of Colorado, and he's describing how every important issue or every great reform movement in the history of the United States passes through 3 critical phases. The first phase is ridicule. The second is argument, when ideas would be debated back and forth. And the third and critical phase would be adoption. So he's saying to men in Colorado in 1870, it rests with you to say whether Colorado will accept this reform, women's suffrage, in its first stage, as our sister territory of Wyoming has done, or in the last, whether she will be a leader in the movement or a follower. For the logic of progressive civilization leads to the inevitable result of universal suffrage. So Governor McCook made this profound pronouncement in 1870, and the first opportunity that we had to write suffrage into state law actually came about in 1876, when Colorado became a state. And as we were approaching statehood, there were conventions held in Denver, conventions that were charged with writing our state's constitution. What would it include? What would it exclude, et cetera? There was an opportunity to grant women the right to vote in our state's constitution, but the legislators deferred. Article 7 of our state constitution states that the General Assembly may at any time extend by law the right of suffrage to persons not herein enumerated, meaning they could place a measure on the ballot so that the men of Colorado, the people, the voters of Colorado could vote for it, but they deferred on taking action in terms of placing it into our Constitution. However, at that time, they decided to give women what's called half a loaf. In essence, women were allowed to vote in school district elections only. And this was an important concession because, of course, in the 19th century, this concept of separate spheres had held a lot of sway. So separate spheres, meaning women's sphere of influence was inside the home and hearth, family and children. She oversaw the secular and religious education of her children and her family. Men's sphere was everything outside of the home, so the competitive, capitalistic marketplace, the world of politics. And these two spheres were really, really defined, of course, by gender. And so it was assumed that it would be appropriate for women to vote in school district elections because they oversaw the education of their children, so totally appropriate. Moving forward, the legislators instructed the First General Assembly of Colorado to place a measure on the ballot. So the men in our state would go to the polls and vote on whether they would grant suffrage to women or not. Interestingly enough, two Colorado legislators produced a minority report, a minority opinion. They disagreed with their colleagues. And these two legislators were Agapito Vigil from Huerfano and Los Animas counties and Henry P.H. Romwell from northern Colorado. Very important to mention that Agapito Vigil spoke Spanish. He was one of three Hispano legislators present at the Colorado Convention convened to move us towards statehood. And these two gentlemen produced a minority report advocating for equal suffrage. In the report, it states, it's false that woman is inferior to man. This capacity of woman to govern has been shown. There's hardly a kingdom or empire which does not point out to a reign when the scepter was held by women in war or in peace. The truth is we are a human race, part of us men, part of us are women, both equal, each superior and each inferior. Each is part and parcel of the same humanity. Really profound words from these two state legislators. In Colorado Springs in particular, there were some notable proponents, advocates for women's suffrage. One of them was none other than Major Henry McAllister. He was born in Delaware, raised in Philadelphia, educated in Quaker schools. If this sounds familiar to you, it is exactly parallel to Colorado Springs founder General William Jackson Palmer. And of course, the two were close business associates here in Colorado Springs. When McAllister arrived in 1872, he became immediately involved with all of Palmer's business enterprises, the National Land Company, Colorado Springs Company. He was a trustee of Colorado College. He's also a suffrage advocate because his Quaker faith is so critical, so central to his worldview. His Quaker faith dictates that all people are equal in the eyes of God. So McAllister is an abolitionist and he is a suffragist. He attends the suffrage convention in 1877 in Denver. He's on the executive board of Colorado Women's Suffrage Association, and he's a featured speaker at a suffrage festival held in the Garden of the Gods here in Colorado Springs that same summer. But there are also advocates in Colorado Springs who are lesser well known. On the left, we're looking at a photograph of Eliza Tupper Wilkes. And on the right, we're looking at a beautifully penned letter by Mrs. Mary Shields. And unfortunately, we don't have a photograph of Mary Shields, but this is a letter she sent to the governor of the state of Kansas, asking him to come to Colorado and help spread the word about women's suffrage, to be an activist here, to speak on behalf of the suffrage movement. Mrs. Mary Shields was deeply involved in the Women's Christian Temperance Union here in Colorado and actually became president, statewide president in 1880. And she, in 1877, began to speak out in Colorado Springs. She and Eliza Tupper Wilkes attended the conference up in Denver, where members of our state legislature were present, and they are advocating for suffrage. Mrs. Mary Shields uses the argument that women, as staying in their sphere, caretakers of home and hearth and their family, women needed suffrage to better advocate for their families, to better advocate for their needs, and especially to advocate for the eradication of alcohol, which was destroying families in the 19th century. Eliza Tupper Wilkes is also a really interesting story. She was the first ordained woman minister in the state of Colorado, and she's the founder of the first Unitarian congregation here in Colorado Springs. Eliza Tupper Wilkes gives an opening prayer at the convention in Denver in 1877, and she uses biblical passages to preach, to speak out, to advocate for women's suffrage. And she uses biblical imagery and words to share the message that men and women are equal in the eyes of God. So both of these women spoke frequently in Colorado Springs, but they also traveled around to farms and ranches and mining camps in southern Colorado to advocate for suffrage as well. Now, who were the opponents? None other than Archbishop Matchbook from Denver, a very powerful Catholic priest, archbishop of the diocese in Colorado. And Matchbook used his pulpit to preach strongly, virulently, forcefully against suffrage. And some of the language he uses is really interesting because it sounds a lot like arguments that are used in the 20th century. He describes, "We do not hesitate to pronounce that women's suffrage would weaken and finally break up and destroy the Christian family. The greatest danger to American society is that we are rapidly becoming a nation of isolated individuals without any family ties or affections." So he's equating women's suffrage to breaking up the traditional family. And so he preaches from his pulpit, but he also travels around the state of Colorado, and he's a really influential figure. And his opinion is widely respected. To sum up some of the other anti-suffrage reasonings, if you will, here I have a couple of illustrations. On the right, it's female suffrage, male suffering. And on the left, vote for government, no petticoat government in mind. But in general, there are a few anti-suffrage reasonings or arguments, and I've summed them up for you here. First of all, women do not want to vote. So that was a pretty popular opinion at the time. Most women don't even want the vote. It's just a few exceptions who are more strident and outspoken about it. The second, women are too emotional to vote, meaning women are not equipped emotionally, physically, intellectually to handle the rigor of voting. It would cause us great duress or stress, angst and anxiety. We needed to stay in our protected bubble inside the home, inside our sphere. The third, women's voices are represented by their husbands, so giving women suffrage would just be doubling the votes of their husbands, as if women would not vote separately or differently or according to their own conscience. And it turned out women did. That's exactly what they did. Women do not fight in the army, so therefore they should not have the right to vote. Women could still pay taxes, though, by the way. If women got involved in politics, they would not marry or have families. This is a trope that is trotted out time and time again, that there are only a minority of women who wanted to vote, and they were all single. They were unmarried. And finally, why change a system that works? Why change a system that already works? Well, it turns out there's lots of evidence that the system wasn't really working all that well. Here is a postcard, suffragettes, again, that demeaning term, who've never been kissed. Archbishop Matchbook actually says that suffragists were nothing more than battalions of old maids disappointed in love. So not only are they disappointed in love, but they're unlovable, they're unattractive. They're old, unhappy, unmarried women, and that happily married women with families couldn't possibly want the right to vote, or so said the opponents. In studying how suffragists are depicted in newsprint, in things like newspapers and illustrated weeklies, it's really interesting to see how they make masculine, otherwise very feminine looking women. So we have on the left, I think, a really striking portrait of Susan B. Anthony. Look how she's depicted as one of the champions of women's suffrage. She's masculine, she's hardened, she's frankly a bit frightening looking. Then we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who definitely doesn't look threatening. She's grandmother looking, soft looking, but look how she's depicted in the newspaper. Again, very masculine, frightening. She's just scary. And this is how they depict time and time again women who spoke out on behalf of suffrage. Here are a few postcards that they span the era of women's suffrage, really from the late 19th century into the early 20th, but they are representative of messages that we see time and time again in print culture. So on the far left, you can see Mom. She's heading out the door. She's headed off to go vote on election day. And what's Dad doing? He's home holding the 2 crying babies. Women voting means men are emasculated. The role reversal that would take place as a result of women's suffrage would threaten the American family. In the middle, I have to admit this is one of my favorites. My wife's joined the suffrage movement, and I've suffered ever since. So again, reversing the roles. The woman, now that she has the vote, is going to dominate her husband. She's going to emasculate her husband. He's cleaning up while she's in charge. The one on the right, I want you to vote. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. Again, the husband is home, caring for the children, doing the laundry, conducting what would typically be seen as female activities within the home, within the domestic sphere, while the woman has left the home, and the roles have been reversed. One of the funniest things, I think, is this notion that women going to the polls would create chaos. So an important point to remember is that women were already voting. They're voting in school district elections. And there was no undue chaos when women went to the polls to vote for school superintendents, school boards, et cetera. And there's also a great amount of evidence that polling or election day in Colorado could be pretty rough with or without women, meaning that things were always not followed by, or were not lawful. Definitely not in ways that we would think of today. So one of my favorite books that describes the real life, what it really looked like to live in a Colorado mining camp in the late 19th, early 20th century, is The Life of an Ordinary Woman by Ann Ellis. It's an unvarnished look at mining camp life. She doesn't paint herself in the perfect light. She tells things like it is. And she's describing an election where Otto Mears gave prospective voters hams, bacon, and sacks of flour. So he's bribing people for their votes. Another time, I remember a spring wagon being filled with men much worse for wear and many cases of very, very bad eggs. The wagon was driven up and down the streets, and each Republican's house was rotten egg. So it sounds like elections were already pretty rough, or had the capacity to be pretty rough. Women had nothing to do with that, and in terms of creating chaos at the polls. Now, in the 1877 campaign, what's a really interesting component of it is that Colorado was visited by nationally renowned, notable women's suffragists like Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone came to Colorado, and by all accounts, when you read the newspapers and you can see them appearing, notices of them appearing in camp after camp, mining town after mining town, farming community after farming community, they canvassed the state and they gave talks to anyone that would listen, really. And so on your right, we have a broadside from Susan B. Anthony, the Invincible, her talk, Woman Wants Bread, Not the Ballot, in Boulder, Colorado. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of going to Lake City, Colorado, and standing on the doorstep of the Lake City courthouse in the exact spot where Susan B. Anthony gave one of her suffrage speeches to, by all accounts, a pretty rowdy group of Colorado miners. And I think about the bravery that took, and I think about, well, how well was her message received, and what did that really take? First of all, it's an arduous journey, and then second of all, to come in and to make this pitch to Colorado men who might or might not be even interested in listening what you had to say. So Susan B. Anthony, in her sort of tour around Colorado, gave this particular talk, Woman Wants Bread, Not the Ballot, quite often. And it's a pretty sophisticated argument. She's making the argument that women are already economically supporting their families. They are in Colorado, due to the boom and bust economy, when gold or silver ore was found and a mine was employing hundreds, if not thousands of men, or an entire mining camp employing thousands of men, times could be pretty good. But when that ore played out and the mines all closed, those men had to move on. They moved on over the hill to the next camp, to the next load, always searching for the next big thing. And they would leave behind women and children, and the women often had to fend for themselves. Men could be gone for days, weeks, or sometimes months at a time with very little communication. And women in Colorado were supporting their families, even when their husbands were employed. Women were doing baking. They were doing washing for others. They were taking in boarders. They were dressmakers. They were milliners. They were each other's midwives. So women in Colorado had always helped support their family financially, working class women. And this is an argument that if women are already doing that work, women are already supporting their families, why not give them the political rights incumbent with the economic value that they're already producing? Why not extend to them the same democratic rights that their husbands enjoy? So Susan B. Anthony gave this talk. It was a message that resonated with some, and unfortunately tended to not resonate with more. So the measure lost by a 2-to-1 margin. The outcome of the election in 1877 was not positive in terms of supporting women's suffrage. 6,612 for women's suffrage, 14,053 against. So the question is why? Why did it not pass? First of all, both political parties at the time, the Democratic and Republican parties, distanced themselves from the measure. Neither party signed on to support it. Second of all, the alcohol and saloon interests launched a very aggressive campaign. And because they knew that once women gained the franchise, gained the right to vote, one of the key issues women were proponents of at the time was prohibition. And they were working toward prohibition because women really knew firsthand the dangers of abuse of alcohol in terms of what that did for Colorado families. So for instance, Colorado miners who would get their pay on a Friday afternoon and before they made their way home might stop at 1, 2, 3 saloons, might come home hours later. They might return with pennies in their pocket or sometimes no money at all. And it was left up to the wives and the mothers and the sisters and the daughters to figure out how to feed the family, how to keep things going until the next paycheck. But alcohol consumption and alcohol abuse also meant domestic violence, violence in general, and nobody suffered more than women and children. So women were eyeing prohibition in Colorado, and the WCTU was a powerful force. So alcohol in saloons came out strongly against it, and they had great reason to fear because one of the efforts once women gained the right to vote was indeed prohibition. Colorado voted itself dry before the rest of the nation. So another reason why it didn't work in 1877 was because there were small pockets of activists across the state, but no organized coalition, no real widespread grassroots effective coalition building. So people in Greeley weren't communicating with Canyon City and vice versa. Also, in 1877, they relied on these prominent national suffrage leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone it turns out these women and their message were not popular with Coloradoans who resented outsiders from coming into our state and telling men here how to vote. Now, I just want to mention that Boulder County was the exception in 1877 and voted to approve women's suffrage, but of course, the measure did not pass statewide. Here's an example, an excerpt from an editorial in the Pueblo Chieftain of 9th of October, 1877, that epitomizes just that feeling, that feeling in Colorado that men had. They weren't interested in outsider voices and opinions. And as stated here, Colorado was considered by the woman suffrage shriekers as an excellent place wherein to try experiments. They left their homes in New England to make a desperate effort to have their pet hobby inaugurated here, knowing that its evil effect would not be felt directly by themselves and utterly regardless of the injury which might be inflicted upon us. So there's a sentiment, there's a really strong sentiment in Colorado that other people outside of our state don't get us. They don't understand our problems, and we don't need outsiders coming in and telling us what to do. We want to make our own decisions as to what's best for our families, for our communities, and for our state. So what happens after 1877? Well, it turns out there's still folks working, promoting the suffrage message and spreading the word. And one of them was Caroline Churchill, a really notable author, editor, and publisher from Denver, who published the Colorado Antelope and the Queen Bee, both considered sort of the forerunners of feminist newspapers in the United States. Caroline Churchill, her pulpit is her newspaper, and so she is continuing to hammer home the message that women's equality, women's suffrage will better everyone, not just women, but women need the right to vote to enhance and improve their communities, their families, etc. So here in 1893, she's stating, every woman in the land should be astir in preparation for the coming election. The emancipation of the women of the country simply means the dawn of a golden era, better conditions for every man, woman, and child. These things are not to be achieved without work, but this is our opportunity, and we should be glad of health and strength with which to work for such a cause. So she is writing for a couple of decades prior to the successful movement in 1893. There were other attempts to pass suffrage bills, placing measures on the ballot for the general electorate before 1893, and they weren't successful. But there is always an active organization in the state. So in 1876, it's the Territorial Equal Suffrage Association. It becomes the Women's Suffrage Association. In 1890, Colorado Equal Suffrage Association. And then in 1893, they rename it the Nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association. Note, nonpartisan and equal suffrage. So they are not linking themselves to either party who failed to come to their support the last time around. So it's nonpartisan. It's not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's an American issue. And then second piece is Matilda Hinman, a suffrage activist from South Dakota, came to Denver, and she was hoping to gain support for her movement back in South Dakota. And she begins to hold meetings in Denver living rooms amongst interested women, and she kind of reignites a fire amongst Colorado suffragists. And they begin to move forward, but with more intention and at a greater stride. So the Nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association of Colorado is galvanized, and they have 28 members and $25 whole in the bank. They develop a brilliant strategy of 4 Ps: pulpit, press, populism, and prohibition. One of their leaders is none other than Elizabeth Piper Ensley, an educator, a journalist, an activist, a community organizer, born and raised near Boston. She is a teacher. She goes on to be a professor at Howard University for a time. She lives in Boston, Washington, D.C. She lives in the South. And she knows how to get things done. She creates organizations and institutions for African-American children, like libraries and schools. She knows how to maximize the potential of money and ideas and strategy, and she takes on the role as treasurer of the Nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association, and she is one of the keys to the success of this movement. So the first P stands for pulpit. Unlike 1877, when prominent clergymen like Archbishop Matchbook he used the bully pulpit to be an opponent for women's suffrage, members of this organization were quick on their feet, and they thought to get to those clergymen first. In other words, women in communities all across the state would go and meet with their clergymen, their ministers, their rabbis, their priests, etc. And they would have a conversation, and they would ask for their clergymen's support for women's suffrage. If their minister, reverend, priest, etc., wasn't able to sign on as an advocate for women's suffrage, they extracted a promise from him that if he couldn't come out for women's suffrage, would he at least not use his pulpit to come out against it. This was an incredibly successful tactic, used widely across the state, and again, a key to their success. In addition to Elizabeth Piper Inslee being a journalist, there were two other journalists as part of this key group of women at the core of the Nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association. One was Minnie J. Reynolds, the founder of the Denver Women's Press Club, and Ellis Meredith, who's often called the Susan B. Anthony of Colorado. Both of these women work for the Rocky Mountain News, so they know how newspapers work. The second key strategy was press. So just like working with clergymen, women in this organization went out and sought from editors and publishers of newspapers across the state, they sought their approval or their backing support of women's suffrage. Again, if they could not support women's suffrage, would they at least pledge not to come out against it in their editorial pages? This was a tremendous success as well, because through this organized effort all across the state, the Nonpartisan Suffrage Association claimed 75% of newspaper support, all newspapers in Colorado, 75%. Unfortunately, one notable exception was the Colorado Springs Weekly Gazette. In March of 1893, they sort of sum up all of the reasons I told you earlier that they could not or should not support women's suffrage. They say, we do not believe a majority of women in the state desire it, but those who do are working for it actively. Those who don't are making no protest. So essentially, again, just a minority of women want it. Most women don't. All of this aside from the question whether women are qualified by their knowledge of public affairs, again, hearkening back to that notion that women's separate sphere isolated them from the competitive world of politics and business, and they just simply didn't know enough. And finally, we have enough voters now who do not vote. Why add to the number? So they're actually, instead of saying everything already works perfectly, they're saying the system doesn't work, and why should we add more voters to it? In the summer of 1893, the country experiences what's known as the Panic of 1893. It's a worldwide economic recession, the likes of which had never been seen before. The economy crashes, and Colorado and the West in particular are very hard hit because lots of folks out here are living on the margins. They're living on credit. And because of the boom and bust economy of Colorado that we talked about earlier, businesses closed, mines shut down. 50% of Colorado's mines were shuttered. That meant thousands of miners are now moving away from their homes in the Colorado mining camps, looking for new opportunities. And in total, 377 business failures that summer of 1893, and 45,000 people were thrown out of work. These are in the months directly preceding this popular election. So how could suffrage support workers in Colorado? Well, the Populist Party and miners and working class Coloradoans who were in support of the Populist Party believed that, first of all, the extraction and minting of silver would benefit the majority of working class folks. So having more money in circulation would actually benefit them. So they're pro-silver. Their platform essentially sought to wrench power away from the hands of politicians and put more power into the people's hands. And so populists helped promote women's suffrage in the summer of 1893 as a means to double their power, as a means to wrestle power away from politicians and allow more Coloradoans to speak out with one voice. There had long been a feeling in Colorado that people outside of our borders, outside of our state, especially anyone to the east, politicians and businessmen and bankers in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, they just don't understand our problems out here and they don't represent us. So populism actually strengthened the argument to give women the right to vote as it takes place during a worldwide economic panic. So that's the third P. We, at the time in Colorado, had one of the few populist governors. His name was Davis Witherow. He was a newspaper publisher and business owner from Aspen, and he supported women's suffrage. He actually felt that giving women the right to vote in Colorado, again, would strengthen his numbers in terms of populist support across the state, but it also sent a strong message to those outside the state and those in Washington that, again, they're not representing Colorado's best interests. Davis Witherow helped support the measure as the House Bill 118 moved forward and was placed on the ballot in the fall of 1893. He's an interesting personality and an interesting politician. He became quite unpopular both inside and outside of the state because of the measures, the extreme measures he took to help combat the economic recession in Colorado. In fact, he went so far as to propose minting our own coinage using Colorado silver that would be sent down to Mexico and made into coinage. His critics mocked him. They called these the Fandango dollars, and they mocked him, they ridiculed him, and he essentially wasn't terribly effective after that point. But nevertheless, he supported women's suffrage, although he would later go on to regret it, because as soon as women gained the franchise, they voted their consciences, they voted their pocketbooks, they voted according to their own values and decisions, and they swiftly helped vote him out of office. He was later said to be pretty angry and resentful and changed his mind and was no longer a proponent of women's suffrage. An interesting ally in this fight is none other than Mrs. Elizabeth Baby Doe Tabor, wife of Colorado silver mining millionaire Horace Tabor. Horace Tabor at one time was phenomenally wealthy. This family went from rags to riches to rags once again. He had real estate holdings throughout the state, including the Tabor Opera House up in Leadville and the Tabor Business Block in Denver. And Elizabeth Baby Doe Tabor was said to have requested/demanded that her husband allow the Nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association to have offices in the toniest, the most important business block in all of Colorado. First of all, because of its proximity to the downtown business district and the capital. And having office space in this building meant proximity, and proximity is power. So in the lobby and in the hallways, important business people in Colorado would be passing by women representing the Nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association, and they had conversations. They had those face-to-face interactions. It's hard to not listen to someone or to give someone the benefit of the doubt when you see them every day. So these women having offices in this building meant they had proximity to power. After all, that's why lobbyists are all on K Street in Washington, D.C., so they can have access to the seat of power, either in the nation or in the state. So an interesting development in 1893 that actually worked to the benefit of the suffrage movement was that Colorado was shunned by national leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, Carrie Chapman Catt did come to Colorado. She toured, she gave speeches. She actually was received pretty well. But nationally prominent leaders of the National Women's Suffrage Association, like Stanton and Anthony, refused to come. In fact, in the summer of 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair, there was a Women's Congress, and Ellis Meredith went as a representative of Colorado, and she met with these national leaders, and she asked them for their support, both materially and in terms of people coming to Colorado and working toward the effort, and the national leaders refused. They said it's not going to happen. It's never going to be successful. Colorado is not going to vote pro-suffrage in 1893. And so as a result, we're not going to spend our precious resources, time, people, and money in Colorado. Instead, they went all in on Kansas. All of their resources were pledged toward a movement in Kansas that, interestingly enough, was ultimately unsuccessful. Now, having these national leaders not come to Colorado actually works to our benefit in terms of Colorado men. Remember back in 1877, they resented what they saw as interlopers or outsiders coming in and telling them what to think, how to vote. And so not having them in our state meant that local women stepped up. Local women gave the speeches. Local women made those connections. They did the advocacy work. And again, it's a lot harder to say no to someone that you know rather than someone who's coming in from out of state. Here's another example of some symbolic imagery that they were using in the summer of 1893. So on our right, we have equal rights, equal responsibilities, equal suffrage. And there is Lady Columbia, but she's got Colorado across a banner across her chest. She's standing in the middle and she's saying, suffrage means we will be co-equal and we will be co-responsible for the welfare of citizens within our communities and within our states. Women are capable of stepping up and they want to do so. And on the left, there's none other than the likeness and words from revered President Abraham Lincoln. This is a generation that may have voted for Lincoln, remembered Lincoln. Certainly, Lincoln's presence loomed large in the United States in the 1890s. So his image of him as a standing figure, and a quote from him, an excerpt, "I go for all sharing the privileges of government who assist in bearing its burdens, by no means excluding women." So again, it's not just about getting something, it's about giving something. Women can help share the responsibility and the burdens of governance with men. Here are a couple of postcards that date from around this era on the left and then a little bit later on the right, towards the March for the 19th Amendment. So let's start with the one on the right. So it states, "Every boy loves and respects his mother and her teachings in early life. Why, therefore, after becoming a man, should he deem her his inferior mentally?" It really speaks to the fact that women's purview was the care and education of children and the nurturers, and they oversaw their education, again, secular and religious. So why, if she did such a great job that she could vote in school district elections and she oversaw her children's education, would she suddenly be unfit as they grow older? So it's making a pretty persuasive argument. On the left, we have an illustration that says, "Votes for mother. She works for us now that father's dead." Now, this kind of image would have really resonated with those in Colorado because, again, if a working class male, a father, a husband, father figure, was injured, there are no social safety nets in Colorado in 1893 or in the country. There is not workers' compensation. There's not unemployment insurance. If, God forbid, he was killed on the job, that wife or mother would be solely responsible for caring for her children, but having very little means to do so. So this is a particularly powerful and potent message. So alcohol and saloon interests. The 1893 movement really, the alcohol and saloon interests didn't actually have time. They took it for granted that this measure would not be successful once again. So they didn't have the time or the foresight to organize themselves so strongly as they did in 1877. And also in the 1890s, people had in our state a couple of decades of experience in seeing how damaging the abuses of alcohol were to families. And people were having conversations about prohibition. They were willing to consider this as an opportunity to empower women to make these decisions. Now, It's not necessarily that folks were voting pro-prohibition in 1893, but it was something to be considered amidst this backdrop of home life, work life in Colorado. Now, finally, I love this photograph. It's women who are standing outside of a polling place in something that would be considered absolutely illegal today. Women actually went to the polls in some communities, not to vote, but to stand outside, sort of as forming a gauntlet that men had to walk through. They also had used the opportunity in the days and weeks and months before the election to make connections with men that they knew, with their own husbands, their own sons, their own brothers and fathers, etc., but also to those that sold them their groceries, who they purchased services from. And they would go to their grocer and say, you know me. This is not a blanket issue. This is not a larger issue. This is about giving me the right to vote. You know me, you can trust me, I'm in your community. This kind of relationship building and face-to-face conversation proved really powerful and very persuasive. It's hard to say no to someone that you know. And so here is a ballot. It's actually from the collections of History Colorado, our state historic site. And it's fantastic because you can see no matter what political party, the issue to be voted on is equal suffrage, and it's equal suffrage approved, equal suffrage not approved. So simply by checking one of those boxes, someone would be voting pro or con against suffrage. And note that it says equal suffrage. It's not women's suffrage. They're pushing the issue that this is about equality, these measures of equality extending to more Americans rightfully given to them through the Constitution. So the results of the election in 1893 are 35,698 for equal suffrage, 29,461 against. And so Western women wild with joy was the headline. Colorado women are citizens. Voting is about more than just, marking that box or putting the ballot into the box. It is about your humanity being recognized. It's about you being put on equal footing with your peers. It's also about holding your politicians responsible. How can a politician be held accountable if he knows that you cannot vote for him? Only through voting can you vote someone into office and out of office. And so to get the franchise extended to you, to have suffrage, to be a voter is a recognition of your citizenship, but also that you have a right to hold everyone, all your local level, state level, and national level accountable. So what would Colorado women do next? What would happen? Would there be chaos at the polls? Are women too emotional to vote? They'd already proven that they weren't. Here is a billboard going up that says, women of Colorado, you have the right to vote. Get it for women of the nation by voting against Woodrow Wilson. So now it's about you have the right to vote. What do you do now? How do you work to expand the franchise for your sisters and cousins and friends and mothers, etc., grandmothers across the rest of the country? And how do you work within your community, and how do you work outside of your community? Well, one of the first things that women did after getting the right to vote is they elected the first 3 women in the entire nation in 1894 were elected to the state legislature. Clara Cressingham from Arapahoe County, Carrie Hawley from Pueblo County, and Frances Clock from Arapahoe County. So they went to the ballot, they went to the polls, and they voted women into office. What would those women do? What kinds of issues would they champion? Well, it turns out they championed women and children, because women in Colorado have always worked to better their communities. And this is Elvis Meredith commenting in the Atlantic Monthly in 1908. She's kind of summing up. So what's the result? What are the fruits of all of this labor? What have women done in Colorado? Well, one of the things they did was they allowed women to be co-guardians and share custody of their own children in the case of a divorce or something like that. That's pretty significant. They also established a state home for dependent children. she goes on to say that in no other place in the world are children better cared for than in Colorado. And that in particular, Colorado laws are enforced. So they're not just put on the books, but they're actually enforced. And this is thanks to women, both voting and in the Colorado State Legislature. Of course, there were critics too. And one of the critics was Elizabeth Cass Goddard of Colorado Springs, a colonial dame and a former suffragist herself. She said, but the results aren't enough. We haven't moved fast enough, far enough. No law has been put on the statute book of Colorado for the benefit of women and children that has been put there by the women. She's stating that the type of politicians hasn't been changed, that women haven't instantaneously overnight cleaned up politics. And how could they? Because, of course, women alone weren't voting. It's the shared responsibility of men and women to clean up politics in Colorado. These kinds of conversations and this type of examination is occurring post-1893. Colorado is being looked at closely as an example of what are the results of suffrage, both inside the state and outside the state. So journalists came to Colorado and they wrote a series of articles. Did suffrage create degenerate women? Did it loosen the morals? Did it break away the fibers of the traditional family? So this kind of debate back and forth goes on for a few decades until, of course, the National Amendment was passed. And then Colorado is no longer so closely examined under the microscope. But of course, we continue to have a conversation nationally of the role of women in politics and the role of women voting. Who do they vote for? Why? And what are the results? So women in Colorado Springs in particular, let's come back closer to home. Women prior to suffrage and after suffrage are working to benefit their communities. And in Colorado, there's a really active group of women who form the Colorado Springs Civic League. And they have lofty goals about improving the community from inside out. They are devotees of the City Beautiful movement. They actually bring in Charles Mulford Robinson, who is a nationally prominent landscape architect and designer, to come in and look at how to clean up Colorado. This is all, the backdrop of this effort is, of course, the progressive era, in which if we clean up a city, literally the streets, the sidewalks, we plant trees, we create parks, they've created the first playgrounds for children in Colorado Springs. If we clean up the city from the inside out, people will be improved mentally, emotionally, intellectually, physically. And these women felt it was their obligation to lead the charge. So the Colorado Springs Civic League promoted the City Beautiful movement. They actually created the Colorado Springs city flag, which is still in use today. They advocated for a broad range of efforts, all seeking improvement for people and the place that they lived. But they grew a little frustrated with just the activism on the local level. They wanted to become more active in the national movement for women's suffrage, pushing for, instead of a state-by-state succession of state voters granting women's suffrage across the country, people were growing tired and frustrated with how long it was taking. And instead, they changed course and they set their sights on a federal amendment to the Constitution. So women from the Civic League over time became radicalized and became more active, and they joined the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which eventually became the National Women's Party. And women in Colorado Springs were so active, so dedicated, and so successful at their advocacy that Colorado Springs actually became the Colorado headquarters for the National Women's Party, as can be seen in this photograph taken in 1915, early 1916 on North Tejon Street. The location of the National Women's Party headquarters was essentially where Jose Muldoon is today. Think about that for a second. What I find is really remarkable is that in terms of population, Colorado Springs in the early 20th century had a population 35,000, and they had women that were active on a national level in the National Women's Party, so prominent that we were the Colorado headquarters. instead of our capital city of Denver that outnumbered us by far. So it's a recognition of how hard women were working in Colorado Springs and our community's openness to the National Woman's Party and the federal amendment. So here's a slide of some very influential, prominent suffragists from Colorado Springs. I want to draw your attention to the top left corner, Lillian Kerr. Lillian Kerr was the founder of the Colorado Springs Women's Club. She was co-founder of the Colorado Springs Civic League. She ran for city council in the 19-teens unsuccessfully, but she was the first woman appointed to the Colorado Springs Planning Commission. So again, she was making change in the community. She also tirelessly advocated for years throughout the 19-teens for a municipal utilities department. Prior to this time, there were several different private companies that offered gas and electric services to Colorado Springs residents. And she felt that that was not to the benefit of the majority of citizens because those companies could charge whatever prices, whatever the market would bear. She felt that it was unfair. And so she advocated, she wanted to clean up government, she wanted to organize, she wanted to create more efficiency. She advocated tirelessly for the development of a municipal utilities department, and she was successful. In 1924, 1925, Colorado Springs opened the Martin Drake Power Plant, the first city municipal electric plant in our city's history. On the top right is another person of the same generation. That's Dr. Caroline Spencer. She's a medical physician who moved to Colorado Springs in 1893, the very same year that suffrage was passed. Very active in the local movement and in the national movement. Dr. Caroline Spencer, Natalie Gray on the bottom left, and Bertha Arnold on the bottom right are all three women who left their homes in Colorado Springs, traveled to Washington, D.C. to join the picket line of the National Woman's Party, protesting in the streets of Washington, D.C. towards President Woodrow Wilson's White House. They were arrested, they were harassed, they were treated poorly by the police. Each was imprisoned briefly, some longer than others. They were manhandled. They later wrote about their experiences. Natalie Gray was a young woman who was raised here in Colorado Springs, and she graduated from Colorado College. Her mother, Susan Gray, was an activist here. And in 1917, when Natalie Gray headed off to Washington, D.C. to protest and to advocate for women's suffrage and to work with the National Woman's Party, her mother bid her farewell and said something incredibly inspiring. So 1917, the world is at war. The United States is about to enter into World War I. And Susan Gray announces, "I have no son to give my country to fight for democracy abroad. And so I send my daughter to Washington to fight for democracy at home." Powerful statement. Woodrow Wilson was claiming the United States needed to enter the war, and shortly after doing so, that the United States would make the world safe for democracy. The protesters and suffragists were saying, well, that's a terrific goal, but we don't have democracy at home. Women do not enjoy democracy at home. And they never tired of pointing out that hypocrisy. So Natalie Gray headed to Washington, D.C. She was arrested for disturbing the police. She pled not guilty, and she served a sentence at the Occoquan workhouse. Bertha Arnold on the bottom right, I have an arrow pointing to her. She's wearing that really interesting hat. Bertha Arnold was also a young woman who attended Colorado College. She was raised here in Colorado Springs. Her father was a prominent physician. She too headed off to DC to protest and to picket. She participated in the Watchfire demonstrations where they burned speeches. They burned the words of President Woodrow Wilson in cauldrons, again, pointing out the hypocrisy of his words, the hypocrisy of his statements regarding democracy. And Bertha Arnold was also arrested, like Natalie Gray and Dr. Caroline Spencer. After she was released, she actually was part of something called the Prison Special. Dressed in their prison garb, she and other women activists from the National Women's Party traveled the country by rail and shared their stories of abuse and mistreatment at the hands of DC police, politicians, etc. And they tried to spread the word about these women were willing literally to put their bodies on the line to fight for suffrage for their sisters across the country because, of course, they already enjoyed it themselves here in Colorado. This is a beautiful photograph of some of the picketers, including Bertha Arnold, who are burning President Woodrow Wilson's speeches in September of 1918 at Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. Again, if you think about the extraordinary effect these women had, and 3 of them are from Colorado Springs, it's quite a statement about how powerful and active the movement was in our community. Now, the story of the ratification is a long one, and I'm going to provide some resources at the end of my presentation for more reading. But essentially, Tennessee is the final state to meet the magic number to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920, and across the nation, we often say women are granted the right to vote. If you study the language of the 19th Amendment, it actually doesn't say we grant women the right to vote. It says that no state or the federal government should prohibit Americans' right to vote on the basis of sex. So instead of being granted the right to vote, it's actually saying we can't limit the right to vote based on sex. And so this is a photograph of a celebration parade, one of the parades that occurred across the country. It's obviously not Colorado Springs or Colorado. Fast forward 3 years, the work still continues because the National Women's Party is not done. They are celebrating the victory of the 19th Amendment, but they want to ensure that women are on equal footing to men. And so they began to promote the Equal Rights Amendment, which was co-written in Colorado Springs by Lillian Kerr, by the way. And in September of 1923, with the assistance of prominent business people in the Colorado Springs Chamber of Commerce, the National Women's Party and the local branch host an anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention, the 75th anniversary. And they fate this celebration by having this beautiful pageant in Garden of the Gods. So we see young girls dressed in white holding suffrage banners, and there's some women in the background. Some of those local activists like Bertha Arnold, Natalie Gray, Dr. Caroline Spencer took part in this celebration by dressing in historic costume as figures like Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, some of the famous suffragists over the course of the 19th century. This event was promoted by the Chamber of Commerce because they actually thought it would be a great opportunity to bring thousands of people to Colorado Springs and show off the beautiful community. And it worked. It was a really tremendously successful event. The hotels were filled. There were lots of events surrounding it. It was a multi-day celebration, and by all accounts, a tremendous success. However, the Equal Rights Amendment was never ratified, was never passed. So the work itself continued beyond, it continued in the form of the Equal Rights Amendment on behalf of the National Women's Party, but the work to expand democracy and to promote the franchise among American citizens continued throughout the course of the 20th century. So for instance, we often say the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, but it's not true because it wasn't applied equally. Not all women gained the right to vote in 1920. So for instance, in 1924, American Indians became American citizens. And so that enabled American Indian women to vote for the first time. There's still barriers, tremendous barriers throughout the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century in terms of voting, poll locations, etc. However, on paper in 1924, when American Indian people became citizens, American Indian women themselves gained the franchise. It wasn't until 1952 when the last vestiges of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the barriers limiting Japanese American citizenship were removed, that Asian American women on paper, their suffrage or their franchise was guaranteed. And of course, we know that it wasn't until 1965, with the passage of the National Voting Rights Act, which sought to remove the most significant barriers for African American women to vote. The barriers like literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and poll taxes. That the Voting Rights Act sought to remove those barriers and allow African American women access to suffrage, to the franchise, to the full extension of citizenship and liberty granted to Americans via the Constitution. Now, it's important to keep in mind that in many communities, the work to ensure democracy and equal access to the ballot continues to this day. This has been a pretty quick overview of a complicated topic, and I thank you so much for joining me. But I hope more than anything that maybe I've piqued your interest about one particular aspect of the women's suffrage story in Colorado. So again, go to the History Colorado website for more information about activities occurring all throughout our state. Go to the website of the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum at cspm.org to learn more about our exhibit that we're hosting at the museum and more activities that we'll be offering throughout the course of 2020. But if you'd like to do a little bit of reading, I want to recommend a few books for you. So first of all, Extraordinary Women of the Rocky Mountain West, published by PPLD. It's one of their compilation books. The chapters by Chris Nickel on Dr. Caroline Spencer, Bertha Arnold, and Natalie Gray are phenomenal. No one knows more than Chris Nickel about the work that these women did on a national level to promote the 19th Amendment, and it's fantastic reading, so I really recommend it. In terms of unique stories that you haven't heard before, stories about women of color, this is an effort that spanned the country, but also it was much more inclusive than we have ever fully disclosed in the past. And it's incumbent upon us in 2020 to talk about the full measure, the full breadth of this movement. And the Susan Ware's book, Why They March, is an excellent resource. There are a couple more books coming out later in the year that I'm looking forward to reading. But Why They Marched is fantastic. It tells the stories of women that you might not have heard before. And finally, The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss is about the complicated story, the fight, the battle state by state to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. And it's a powerful book. It's a great story. If you have any questions for me, I can be reached at Leah, Leah.Witherow, Witherow, at coloradosprings.gov. That's my email at the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. You can also look me up on the website. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for sharing time with me, learning about women's suffrage in Colorado, and take care of everyone. Be well, and I hope to see you at the museum sometime soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.